The courtroom of the county courthouse in Arlington, Virginia, was filled to capacity on a crisp autumn morning. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, highlighting the polished mahogany benches and ornate molding along the ceiling. The air was thick with anticipation, the quiet murmurs of spectators punctuated by the sharp clatter of a gavel striking wood. Judge Robert Hensley, known for his no-nonsense demeanor and firm but fair judgments, presided over the proceedings. His dark robes hung neatly from his broad shoulders as he scanned the room with piercing gray eyes. At 54, he was a picture of authority, a man whose reputation as a family court judge was built on the careful balance of compassion and adherence to the law. This morning's case, a custody battle between two estranged parents, was proceeding like any other, at least until it wasn't. "And, Your Honor," the plaintiff's attorney continued, her voice steady and rehearsed, "we strongly believe the child's well-being would be best served by awarding primary custody to our client. The home environment—" "Judge, I'm your son." The words rang out with a sudden force that cut through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the crowd, the murmurs rising to a crescendo of disbelief. All eyes turned to the source of the interruption, a boy standing in the center aisle, his small frame vibrating with both fear and determination. Judge Hensley froze, the gavel slipping from his hand and clattering onto the bench. For a moment, the room seemed suspended in time. His stern expression cracked, his features betraying a rare glimpse of shock. The boy was about 12 years old with unruly sandy blonde hair that fell into his piercing blue eyes that, Judge Hensley realized with a jolt, looked eerily familiar. Who are you?" he finally managed, his voice low and unsteady. "Elijah," the boy replied, his voice wavering but steady. "Elijah Matthews. That's the name they gave me at the orphanage. But I think you're my dad." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Lawyers whispered furiously to their clients, reporters scribbled notes, and spectators exchanged incredulous looks. Near the boy stood a woman in a navy suit, her face pale and her hands outstretched as if she wanted to pull him back. A name tag on her lapel read, "Ms. Clare," identifying her as a social worker. "Bailiff," Judge Hensley called, his voice hoarse but commanding. "Clear the courtroom. Everyone out except for—" He paused, his gaze locking onto the boy. "Except for Elijah, Ms. Clare, and myself." The bailiff moved swiftly, ushering out the crowd despite their protests. Cameras were lowered, notebooks closed, and the heavy oak doors slammed shut behind the last spectator. The courtroom, now eerily silent, felt cavernous. Judge Hensley removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose, a gesture that betrayed the turmoil he was trying to suppress. "Elijah," he began, his voice softer now, "do you understand the seriousness of what you've just claimed? This is a courtroom, not—" "It's not a joke," Elijah interrupted, his fists clenched at his sides. "I found a picture of you with my mom. It was in my file at the orphanage." Ms. Clare stepped forward, placing a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your Honor," she said gently, "if I may explain. Elijah has been in the state's care since he was an infant. His case file contains limited information, only his first name, his date of birth, and a photograph that he recently discovered." Judge Hensley's chest tightened. "A photograph?" Ms. Clare opened a battered folder she had been clutching and produced a small worn photo. She hesitated before handing it to the judge. "This was found with Elijah when he was left at the hospital. The date on the back coincides with his birth." With trembling hands, Judge Hensley took the photograph. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the image. It was unmistakably him, 15 years younger, standing beside a woman with auburn hair and a radiant smile. Sarah. The name floated to the surface of his mind like a ghost from the past. "Elijah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "where did you get this?" "It was in my file," the boy replied, his voice small now, as if the weight of the moment had finally caught up to him. I've been watching you. I've come to your courtrooms with my school groups. I knew it was you." The judge looked up sharply. "You've been watching me?" Ms. Clare interjected, her tone cautious. Elijah is resourceful, Your Honor. He's been coming to the courthouse as part of various school outings. I wasn't aware until recently that he had connected you to the photograph. Judge Hensley leaned back in his chair, the photo still clutched tightly in his hand. Memories he had long buried began to resurface. Memories of a summer spent with Sarah Matthews, of laughter and whispered promises by the lake. And then, the abrupt end. Her disappearance without explanation. He had told himself he had moved on, but now sitting before him was a boy with Sarah's unmistakable eyes. I need some time, he said finally, his voice firm but strained. Ms. Clare, please take Elijah back to the waiting area. I need to think. Elijah looked as if he wanted to protest, but Ms. Clare gently guided him toward the door. Before leaving, the boy turned back, his blue eyes locking onto the judge's. I'm not lying, he said softly. You're my dad. I know you are. Judge Robert Hensley remained seated at the bench long after the courtroom had emptied. The photograph in his hands felt heavier than it should, as though it carried the weight of the years that had passed since it was taken. Sarah's face stared back at him, her auburn hair catching the light, her bright smile full of life and possibility. His own younger self stood beside her, arms casually draped over her shoulders, blissfully unaware of what was to come. The name, Elijah Matthews, echoed in his mind, mingling with memories of Sarah's soft laughter and the way her eyes had crinkled when she smiled. Could it really be possible? Could this boy, this brave, determined child, be his son? As he stared at the photograph, fragmented memories began to resurface. He remembered the summer they'd spent together, long weekends by the lake, spontaneous road trips and quiet nights where they'd talked about everything and nothing. Sarah had been full of life, her adventurous spirit a perfect foil to his more measured nature. But then, without warning, she had disappeared. No goodbye, no explanation, just silence. The sound of his office door creaking open pulled him from his reverie. His assistant, a middle-aged woman named Carol, poked her head inside. Judge Hensley, everything all right? Yes, Carol, he replied, his voice rough. He cleared his throat and straightened his posture. I just need a moment. Carol hesitated, her sharp eyes scanning his face. You sure? You've got the Patterson case scheduled in an hour. I know, he said, nodding. I'll be ready. When she left, the silence returned, pressing in on him like a physical weight. He placed the photograph carefully on his desk, smoothing it flat with trembling fingers. The date on the back, July 15th, 2010, burned into his memory. The timeline matched. Elijah's story, as improbable as it seemed, aligned with everything he remembered. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, his thoughts drifting to Anna. How would he explain this to her? How could he tell his wife of 12 years that the life they had built together might be upended by a boy claiming to be his son? Meanwhile, Anna Hensley was seated at the kitchen table in their modest suburban home, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. The TV in the living room played softly in the background, tuned to a local news channel. She wasn't paying attention until she heard her husband's name. In a dramatic turn of events, the news anchor announced, a young boy interrupted courtroom proceedings this morning, claiming to be the son of Judge Robert Hensley. The story has sparked widespread curiosity and speculation. Anna's head snapped up, her heart pounding. She reached for the remote, turning up the volume as the screen displayed shaky footage of the boy standing in the courtroom, his voice clear and resolute. Judge, I'm your son. Her hand flew to her mouth. The coffee mug toppled onto the table, spilling its contents, but she didn't notice. She sat frozen, her mind racing as the news anchor continued. Judge Hensley has not issued a statement, but sources say the boy, identified as Elijah Matthews, claims to have evidence linking him to the judge. We'll continue to follow this developing story. Anna stared at the screen, her chest tightening. She felt a storm of emotions, confusion, fear, and most surprisingly, a pang of something that felt like hope. She knew Robert's past was something he rarely talked about. He had mentioned a few relationships before they met, but never in detail. Could this boy truly be his son? At Hope Haven Children's Home, Elijah sat on his bunk, staring at the worn photograph in his hands. The orphanage dormitory was quiet, the other children out in the playroom. Ms. Claire had dropped him off with a few kind words of reassurance, but he couldn't shake the nervous energy coursing through him. He turned the photo over, tracing the date written on the back with his finger. This picture was all he had of his mom, and now possibly his dad. He had rehearsed what he would say to Judge Hensley 100 times in his head, but now that it was over, he wasn't sure if he'd said enough. What if he doesn't believe me? He muttered to himself. The door creaked open, and Sammy poked his head inside. Sammy was 8 years old, with messy brown hair and a mischievous grin. He had been Elijah's closest friend and self-proclaimed little brother since he arrived at the orphanage 3 years ago. "Elijah?" Sammy asked, climbing onto the bunk beside him. "Are you in trouble?" Elijah shook his head, offering a small smile. "No, I don't think so." Sammy frowned, his big brown eyes full of concern. "Then why do you look so sad?" Elijah hesitated, then held up the photograph. "You know how I told you about my mom? And how I think I found my dad?" Sammy nodded eagerly. Elijah had shared the story with him countless times, and Sammy had always believed him without question. "Well," Elijah continued, "I told him today. In court." Sammy's eyes widened. "Really? What did he say?" Elijah sighed, leaning back against the wall. "I don't know. He didn't say much. I think he was shocked. Ms. Claire said it might take time." Sammy thought for a moment, then grinned. "He'll believe you. You're the smartest person I know, and if he doesn't, I'll tell him he has to. Nobody says no to me." Elijah chuckled despite himself, ruffling Sammy's hair. "Thanks, Sammy." The younger boy's grin faded slightly as he looked at the photograph. "Do you think, if he's your dad, he'll let me come too? I don't want to stay here without you." Elijah's throat tightened. "I'd never leave you, Sammy. You're my brother. No matter what happens, we'll figure it out." The next morning, Judge Hensley sat at the kitchen table, staring into his untouched cup of coffee. Anna sat across from him, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "You saw the news?" he said quietly. Anna nodded. "I did." "Who is he, Robert?" He hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "His name is Elijah Matthews. He claims he's my son." Anna's eyes widened, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "There was someone, years ago. Sarah. We were together for a while, but she disappeared. I never knew why. Now this boy shows up with a photograph of us, one I haven't seen in over a decade, and claims I'm his father." Anna leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Do you think it's possible?" Robert sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, but I can't ignore it." Anna reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "Then don't. If there's even a chance that he's your son, you owe it to him and to yourself to find out the truth." He looked at her, gratitude and fear mingling in his eyes. "And what if he is? What does that mean for us?" Anna smiled softly, squeezing his hand. "It means we figure it out. Together." 2 days later, the morning sunlight spilled across the parking lot of St. Mary's Hospital. Judge Robert Hensley stepped out of his car, a mixture of anticipation and trepidation tightening his chest. Anna walked beside him, her arm lightly looped through his. She had insisted on coming, her quiet strength a steadying force as he prepared for what lay ahead. Inside, the halls buzzed with subdued activity. Doctors and nurses moved with purpose, their footsteps muffled against the polished floors. At the information desk, a kind-faced receptionist directed them to the pediatric wing, where Elijah and Sammy had been staying after Sammy's recent health scare. When they arrived at the small playroom where the boys were waiting, Robert stopped short. Through the glass window, he saw Elijah sitting on the floor with Sammy, a chessboard between them. Sammy, clearly still recovering, leaned heavily against a stack of cushions, his small frame dwarfed by the hospital-issued pajamas. Elijah's expression was one of intense concentration, his brow furrowed as he explained the game to his younger friend. "They look so natural together," Anna murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Robert nodded, his gaze fixed on Elijah. The boy's every gesture, the way he adjusted Sammy's pieces when his shaky hands faltered, the quiet patience in his voice, spoke volumes about his character. It reminded Robert of himself as a boy, always looking out for his younger siblings before the weight of adulthood had taken hold. Ms. Clare appeared beside them, her presence calm and professional. "They've been inseparable since Sammy's asthma attack," she explained. "Elijah refused to leave his side, even when we told him he needed to rest. That boy has a determination you don't often see." Robert cleared his throat, his voice low. "Can we go in?" "Of course," Ms. Clare said, pushing the door open gently. Elijah looked up as they entered, his eyes widening with surprise. He scrambled to his feet, instinctively positioning himself in front of Sammy as if to shield him from whatever might happen next. "Hey, Elijah," Anna said softly, kneeling to meet his gaze. "How are you doing?" The boy hesitated, his hands clenched into nervous fists at his sides. "I'm fine," he said, glancing quickly at Robert before looking back at Anna. "Is everything okay?" Robert stepped forward, his towering presence softened by the uncertainty in his expression. "Elijah, can we talk for a moment? Just you and me?" Elijah hesitated, his eyes darting toward Sammy, who was watching the exchange with wide-eyed curiosity. Ms. Clare stepped in, her voice gentle. "I'll stay with Sammy, Elijah. He'll be okay." Reluctantly, Elijah nodded. "Okay." Robert and Elijah walked down the hallway, eventually stopping at an empty bench near a large window overlooking the hospital courtyard. The silence between them was heavy, both unsure how to begin. "Elijah," Robert said finally, his voice low and steady. "I want to apologize for how I reacted in court. I wasn't expecting what you said, and it caught me off guard." Elijah glanced down at his hands, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "I'm sorry for interrupting your case," he mumbled. "I didn't know what else to do." Robert studied the boy, noting the way he carried himself, not with the defiance of a child seeking attention, but with the quiet resolve of someone who had faced more than his share of challenges. "You said you found a photograph," Robert prompted. Elijah nodded, pulling the worn picture from his pocket. He handed it over without a word, his eyes fixed on the floor. Robert examined the photograph again, the familiar faces staring back at him. "Where did you find this?" "In my file at the orphanage," Elijah replied. "I asked to see it when I turned 12. They didn't want to show me at first, but I kept asking." Robert nodded slowly, his mind spinning with questions. "Elijah," he began carefully, "I need to know, why did you come to my courtroom that day? Why not just send a letter or ask Ms. Clare to arrange a meeting?" The boy hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper when he finally answered. "Because I thought, if you saw me, you'd know. You'd feel it the way I do." Robert's breath caught in his throat. "Feel what?" Elijah looked up then, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "That we're family." Later that evening, Robert and Anna sat in their living room, the photograph lying between them on the coffee table. The weight of the day hung heavily in the air, both of them lost in thought. "He's a remarkable boy," Anna said softly, breaking the silence. "And Sammy, they're like two halves of the same whole. It's clear they need each other." Robert leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I don't know if I'm ready for this, Anna. What if he's not my son? What if I'm making a mistake?" Anna reached for his hand, her touch grounding him. "And what if he is, Robert? What if this is your second chance? You've spent your whole career fighting for families to stay together. Maybe it's time to fight for your own." Her words settled over him, a quiet truth that he couldn't ignore. After a long pause, he nodded. "We'll do the DNA test," he said finally. "But regardless of the results, Elijah and Sammy deserve a home, and I want to give them that." 2 weeks later, the results arrived. Robert opened the envelope with trembling hands, his heart pounding in his chest. Anna stood beside him, her presence a steadying force. The test confirmed what Elijah had believed all along: Robert Hensley was his biological father. Tears welled in Robert's eyes as the truth sank in. He felt a wave of emotions: relief, guilt, and a deep, overwhelming love for a boy he barely knew but was ready to fight for. The day Elijah and Sammy moved into the Hensley home was a sunny one, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. The boys arrived with little more than a couple of bags and a worn chessboard, their faces a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Anna greeted them warmly, showing them to their new rooms, each lovingly decorated to reflect their personalities. Elijah's room had shelves filled with books, while Sammy's was bright and cheerful with a cozy corner for his medical equipment. Robert stood back, watching as Anna fussed over the boys, making sure they felt welcome. He caught Elijah's eye, and the boy smiled tentatively. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. That evening, they sat down to their first family dinner. The table was filled with laughter as Sammy told a dramatic story about a playground adventure, his eyes sparkling with joy. Elijah watched him with a protective fondness, occasionally chiming in to correct the details. Robert looked around the table, his heart full in a way he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't just a judge or a husband, he was a father. Months later, Robert sat in his study, watching as Elijah helped Sammy with a school project. The boys had settled into their new lives, their bond stronger than ever. Anna entered the room, a cup of tea in hand. "You did the right thing, you know," she said softly, sitting beside him. Robert nodded, his gaze never leaving the boys. "I think they saved me as much as I saved them." Anna smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. Outside, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, blanketing the world in quiet beauty. Inside, the Hensleys were finally complete. A family bound not just by blood, but by love, resilience, and the courage to embrace the unexpected. Marcus sat beside Elijah on the floor of the orphanage playroom, his voice soft but steady. "For years, I carried that weight with me. I told myself I'd never let anyone down the way he let me down, but even now there are times I wonder if I'm good enough, if I'll make the right choices." Elijah looked at Marcus, his blue eyes shadowed with doubt. "What if you change your mind? What if it gets too hard?" Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "That's a fair question. But let me ask you something, Elijah. Do you think I'd be here if I didn't care about you? If I wasn't ready to fight for you and Sammy?" The boy hesitated, his fingers still gripping the edges of the book in his lap. "You said you're really busy, that you might not have time for us." Marcus let out a long sigh, nodding slowly. "You're right. I am busy. And I won't pretend I'll be able to make every soccer game or be there for every bedtime story, but I'll always come back, Elijah. You and Sammy. You're not just another responsibility to me. You're my family." The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Elijah's eyes filled with tears, though he tried to blink them away. "Do you mean that?" he asked, his voice cracking. Marcus reached out, gently placing a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "I mean it. You're my son now, Elijah, and I'll never walk away from that." Elijah stared at him for a long moment before nodding, his walls starting to crumble. "Okay," he whispered, "but you have to promise you won't leave Sammy either." "That's a promise I'll keep," Marcus said firmly. "You're both stuck with me now." Meanwhile, Anna sat with Sammy in another room, watching as the boy carefully pieced together a jigsaw puzzle. She admired his quiet determination, even as his small hands trembled from exhaustion. "Almost done," Sammy murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "The sky's the hardest part." Anna smiled, her heart aching with love for this brave little boy. You're doing an amazing job, Sammy. Do you want some help with the last few pieces? Sammy shook his head, his messy brown hair flopping into his eyes. No, I can do it. Elijah always says if I keep trying, I'll figure it out. Anna's chest tightened. Elijah's right. He's a good big brother. Sammy looked up at her, his gaze serious. Do you think Judge Marcus is like Elijah? That he'll protect us too? Anna knelt beside him, her hands resting gently on his shoulders. I know he will, Sammy. He cares about you both so much, and he's scared because he doesn't want to let you down. But that's how you know he loves you, because he's willing to face that fear for you. Sammy nodded slowly, his small hands returning to the puzzle. I hope you're right, he said quietly. I like him. He's nice, even when he tries to act all serious. Anna laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair out of his face. He's learning from you and Elijah. You two are teaching him what it means to be part of a family. In the following weeks, Marcus and Anna threw themselves into the adoption process, navigating home studies, interviews, and mountains of paperwork. Ms. Clare remained a steady presence, guiding them through each step. But not everyone was supportive. At the courthouse, Marcus faced continued scrutiny from his colleagues, many of whom questioned his ability to remain impartial. You're walking a fine line, Hensley, Judge Peterson warned during a heated exchange in chambers. If this adoption goes through, you'll be under a microscope for the rest of your career. Are you prepared for that? Marcus met Peterson's gaze, his voice calm but resolute. I've spent my entire career fighting for what's right. I won't stop now because it's inconvenient. Peterson leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with a mixture of respect and frustration. You've always been stubborn, Hensley. Just make sure you're ready for the fallout. The day the adoption was finalized dawned bright and clear, the autumn air crisp with the scent of fallen leaves. Marcus, Anna, Elijah, and Sammy sat together in the judge's chambers, waiting for the final paperwork to be signed. Elijah fidgeted in his seat, his nerves showing in the way he tapped his foot against the floor. Sammy sat beside him, clutching his stuffed elephant tightly. Do you think they'll say yes? Elijah asked, his voice barely audible. Marcus knelt in front of him, resting a hand on his shoulder. They already did, Elijah. Today's just a formality. From now on, you and Sammy are officially part of our family. Elijah swallowed hard, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Thanks, Dad. The word hit Marcus like a tidal wave, filling his chest with a warmth he hadn't realized he was missing. He smiled, his voice thick with emotion. You're welcome, son. Months later, the Hensley home was filled with laughter and the scent of baking cookies. Elijah sat at the kitchen table, helping Sammy with his homework, while Anna bustled around the kitchen, humming softly to herself. Marcus stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. The walls were adorned with family photos, pictures of birthdays, vacations, and quiet moments captured in time. The house, once quiet and orderly, now hummed with life. Hey, Dad, Elijah called, looking up from his worksheet. Can you help me with this math problem? Marcus grinned, stepping into the room. Let's see what we've got here. As he sat down beside his son, Sammy leaned over, his voice conspiratorial. He's really bad at math, he whispered, making Anna laugh. Good thing I've got you to help me, Marcus replied, ruffling Sammy's hair. The room filled with laughter, the kind of laughter that only comes from a family bound by love and resilience. Marcus looked around the table, his heart full. For the first time in years, he felt complete. Together, they had found something extraordinary, something worth fighting for. A family, imperfect but unbreakable, built not by chance but by choice. Marcus watched as Elijah and Sammy moved cautiously through their new home. Even though they had been living with the Hensleys for several weeks, there was still an air of uncertainty in their movements, as if they were afraid that at any moment it could all be taken away. Elijah was more reserved than ever, his personality always guarded, as though every step he took was carefully calculated. Sammy, though more cheerful, still woke up some nights whispering if Marcus and Anna would send him back to the orphanage. Each time it happened, Marcus lay awake for hours afterward, staring at the ceiling as Sammy's words echoed in his mind. It was a constant reminder of the wounds the boys carried, invisible scars that would take time to heal. One Sunday afternoon, Marcus decided to take the boys to the local park. He had been thinking that spending time outdoors might ease some of the tension that both children seemed to carry. Anna packed a small picnic, and together they headed to the sprawling green space just a few blocks from their home. The sun was bright, but not too warm, and a gentle breeze rustled the trees lining the park. Families dotted the area, with children laughing and running freely on the playground while parents watched from nearby benches. Sammy's eyes lit up as soon as they arrived, his gaze immediately drawn to the swings and the tall slides. "Can we play, Judge Marcus?" Sammy asked, his voice filled with excitement. Marcus smiled at the boy's use of his formal title, even though he had told him countless times to just call him Dad or Marcus. "Of course," he said, "but only if you promise to be careful." Sammy nodded enthusiastically, grabbing Elijah's hand and pulling him toward the playground. Elijah hesitated for a moment, glancing back at Marcus as if seeking permission. Marcus gave him a reassuring nod, and Elijah finally followed Sammy, his steps slow but steady. Anna spread out a blanket on the grass, setting down the picnic basket while Marcus watched the boys from a distance. Sammy's laughter filled the air as he climbed to the top of the slide, waving triumphantly before sliding down. Elijah stayed closer to the swings, his hands stuffed into his pockets as he watched his younger friend with a faint smile. "They're starting to settle in," Anna said softly, sitting beside Marcus on the blanket. "Maybe," Marcus replied, his eyes never leaving the boys. "But Elijah, I can tell he's still holding back. It's like he's waiting for the other shoe to drop." Anna reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "He's been let down so many times, Marcus. It's going to take more than a few weeks for him to trust that this is permanent." Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just wish I knew how to help him. He's a smart kid, and I know he's trying to protect himself, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Anna rested her head on his shoulder, her voice calm and reassuring. "You're helping just by being here, by showing up every day, even when it's hard. That's what he needs, to see that you're not going anywhere." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the boys play. Eventually, Sammy came running back to the blanket, his face flushed and his hair sticking to his forehead. "I'm thirsty," he announced, plopping down beside Anna and reaching for a juice box from the basket. Elijah followed a few moments later, sitting quietly at the edge of the blanket and picking at a loose thread on his shirt. "Did you have fun?" Marcus asked, handing Elijah a bottle of water. Elijah shrugged, his expression neutral. "It was okay." Sammy, oblivious to Elijah's reluctance, began recounting every detail of his playground adventure, from the slide to the monkey bars. Marcus listened patiently, occasionally glancing at Elijah, who remained quiet but attentive as Sammy spoke. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus suggested a game of catch. He pulled a baseball and a couple of gloves from the picnic basket, hoping the activity might help Elijah open up. Sammy was eager to play, darting across the grass with uncoordinated enthusiasm, but Elijah hesitated again. "I'm not good at sports," Elijah muttered, kicking at the ground. Marcus crouched down to his level, looking him in the eye. "It's not about being good, Elijah. It's just about having fun. And if you don't want to play, that's okay too, but I think you might like it if you give it a try." Elijah studied him for a moment before nodding reluctantly. Marcus handed him a glove, showing him how to wear it properly before tossing the ball gently in his direction. Elijah fumbled the first few throws, his movements awkward and hesitant, but as the game progressed, he began to relax. By the end, he was laughing along with Sammy, chasing after a wild throw that landed in the bushes. On the drive home, Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror and saw both boys slumped against their seats, exhausted but happy. Sammy was already dozing off, his head resting on Elijah's shoulder while Elijah stared out the window, a small but genuine smile playing on his lips. That night, after the boys had gone to bed, Marcus sat in the living room with Anna, a sense of quiet contentment settling over him. "Today was a good day," he said, his voice soft. Anna smiled, curling up beside him on the couch. "It was. And there will be more days like this, Marcus. They just need time, and so do we." Marcus nodded, wrapping his arm around her. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to believe that everything might actually turn out okay. The next morning, Marcus sat at his desk in chambers, reviewing case files, but his focus was elsewhere. The sound of Sammy's laughter from the day before and Elijah's hesitant smile replayed in his mind like a loop he couldn't stop. His phone buzzed on the desk, interrupting his thoughts. It was another email from the Judicial Review Board, a sharp reminder of the scrutiny his decisions were under. Marcus leaned back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose. He knew this wasn't going away, and the pressure was mounting. "You delayed an active custody case because of this boy's claim," Judge Peterson's voice from the last meeting echoed in his mind. "And now you're personally involved with both children. The optics are concerning." Marcus sighed deeply, the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him. He'd spent his entire career building a reputation as a fair and impartial judge, someone who could separate personal feelings from professional duties. But this situation was different. These weren't just names on a file or faces in a courtroom. They were real children. Children who needed him in ways that went far beyond the legal system. Meanwhile, across town, Anna sat under the harsh glare of studio lights at the local news station. The interviewer leaned forward, her expression sympathetic yet curious. "Mrs. Hensley," she began, her voice warm but probing. "What drew you to these boys? What made you and your husband decide to take this step?" Anna took a steadying breath, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. "When you meet Elijah and Sammy," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves, "you see something extraordinary. Their bond goes beyond friendship. They're family in every way that matters." The interview cut to a montage of footage from the hospital, where Elijah had been reading to Sammy in his bed. Donations had started pouring in for Sammy's medical care, and the orphanage's phone lines were flooded with offers of support. Strangers sent messages of encouragement, gifts, and even letters sharing their own stories of adoption and foster care. The community was rallying behind the boys, their story touching hearts in ways no one could have anticipated. "They've already lost so much," Anna continued, her eyes glistening. "Separating them would be cruel. They deserve a chance to stay together and to know what it feels like to have a real family." The interviewer nodded, her expression softening. "It sounds like you and your husband are deeply committed to these boys." "We are," Anna said firmly, her voice leaving no room for doubt. "They've changed our lives in ways we couldn't have imagined, and we want to give them the stability and love they've never had." As the interview aired, the community response grew even stronger. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #KeepThemTogether and #FamilyByChoice. Local newspapers ran headlines like "Judge's Heart versus Judge's Duty" and "Orphaned Boys Unite Community." The attention was overwhelming, but Anna focused on the positive, hoping it would help strengthen their case to adopt the boys. Back at the courthouse, Marcus faced yet another grueling session with the Judicial Review Board. The chamber felt stifling as his colleagues questioned his recent conduct, their tones sharp and their words cutting. "Judge Hensley," one board member began, peering at him over a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. "Your wife's public advocacy for these children, combined with your handling of the initial custody hearing, raises serious concerns about conflicts of interest." Marcus struggled to maintain his composure, his hands clasped tightly on the table in front of him. "I understand the appearance of impropriety," he began, choosing his words carefully. "But I assure you, my decisions in that case were based solely on the evidence presented." "This isn't just about appearances," another member interjected, her tone sharp. "Your career is built on maintaining strict professional boundaries. This situation has compromised that reputation." Marcus felt the familiar wave of frustration rise within him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew losing his temper would only make matters worse. "I've dedicated my life to upholding the law," he said evenly, "and I've always acted in the best interests of the people involved in my cases. That hasn't changed." The tension in the room was palpable as the board deliberated. Marcus sat in silence, his jaw tight as he waited for their verdict. He knew he was walking a fine line, and the outcome of this review could have lasting consequences for his career. At the hospital, Ms. Claire watched as more gifts arrived for the boys: books, toys, and handmade cards from strangers touched by their story. Elijah sat by Sammy's bedside, oblivious to the storm their story had created. "Look, Sammy," he said softly, holding up a glitter-covered card. "Someone drew us as superheroes." Sammy smiled weakly, his fingers clutching his stuffed elephant. "You'd make a good superhero, Elijah. You're already my hero." Elijah's cheeks flushed, and he looked away, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're the real hero, Sammy. You've been through so much, and you're still here." The media attention continued to grow, with reporters camped outside the courthouse and the hospital, eager for updates. Marcus stood at his office window, watching journalists mill about below. His phone buzzed with another message from the review board, but he ignored it for now. His mind was elsewhere, caught between the weight of his professional reputation and the pull of his heart. Anna's words from her interview echoed in his mind. "Sometimes doing the right thing means taking a risk." He turned away from the window, his gaze falling on a framed photograph of his family. For the first time in years, he felt unsure of the path ahead. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the orphanage windows as Ms. Claire sat with Sammy, delivering news that no child should ever have to hear. Her voice was gentle, but nothing could soften the blow of her words. "I'm so sorry, Sammy," she said, her heart breaking as she spoke. "The Petersons, they've decided they won't be moving forward with the adoption." Sammy's small shoulders slumped, and his lower lip trembled. "Because I'm sick," he whispered. Ms. Claire nodded sadly, reaching out to touch his arm. "They weren't prepared for the level of medical care you need." Elijah, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, immediately rushed to Sammy's side. He wrapped his arms around his friend, holding him tightly as tears began to roll down Sammy's cheeks. "It's okay, Sammy," Elijah said fiercely, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "We don't need them. I promise I'll never leave you. We're brothers, remember?" Sammy buried his face in Elijah's shoulder, his tiny frame shaking with sobs. "Nobody wants a sick kid," he choked out, his voice muffled. "That's not true," Elijah insisted, holding his friend even tighter. "I want you. You're my best friend, my brother. We'll find a way to stay together. I promise." Marcus and Anna watched the scene unfold from the doorway, their hearts heavy with emotion. Anna reached for Marcus's hand, squeezing it tightly as tears welled in her eyes. Later that evening, as they sat in their kitchen, the weight of the day's events hung heavily between them. "Those poor boys," Anna whispered, stirring her untouched tea. Sammy's face when he heard the news. Marcus loosened his tie, his professional facade beginning to crack. "The medical bills would be substantial," he said quietly. "The Petersons made their decision based on practical concerns." "Practical concerns," Anna repeated, her voice tight with emotion. "Is that all we're going to consider? Those boys need each other. They need a family who won't give up on them." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "Anna, you know it's complicated. My career is already under scrutiny, taking on 2 children, one with serious medical needs." "I saw how you looked at them today," Anna interrupted softly. "When Elijah was comforting Sammy. Tell me you didn't feel something." Marcus fell silent, remembering the fierce protectiveness in Elijah's eyes and the way Sammy had clung to his friend like a lifeline. The image of them together, supporting each other through yet another disappointment, had stirred something deep within him. The park outing had been a small step forward, but Marcus still couldn't shake the lingering worry that Elijah's walls were too high to breach. Over the following days, he noticed small signs of progress, Elijah helping Sammy with his asthma medication without prompting, or the way he would sit a little closer to Anna during family meals. But even these moments were fleeting, and Marcus often found himself overanalyzing every interaction, wondering if he was doing enough to reassure the boys that they were truly home. At the courthouse, however, his professional life was proving less forgiving. The Judicial Review Board was relentless in their scrutiny of his actions, their concerns growing louder as media coverage of the adoption gained momentum. Sitting at his desk one morning, Marcus found himself staring at yet another letter from Judge Peterson, reminding him of his duty to uphold the appearance of impartiality. It wasn't the first reminder, and it wouldn't be the last. The pressure was mounting, and Marcus knew that every decision he made from this point forward would be under a microscope. As if on cue, his phone buzzed with a text from Anna. She'd been at home with Sammy, who had developed a mild fever overnight. Anna, Sammy's fever is better, but he keeps asking for you. Can you come home early today? Marcus sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. His day was packed with hearings, and leaving early would only fuel his colleagues' criticism of his divided priorities. But the image of Sammy, pale and fragile, tugged at his heart. Marcus, I'll try. Tell him I'll be there as soon as I can. By the time Marcus arrived home that evening, Sammy was asleep on the couch, his favorite stuffed elephant tucked under one arm. Anna greeted Marcus at the door, her expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He's been asking for you all day, she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. Elijah's been reading to him to keep him calm. Marcus smiled faintly, his chest tightening. How's Elijah holding up? Anna hesitated, her gaze thoughtful. Better, I think, but he's still wary. He won't admit it, but I think he's scared that if anything happens to Sammy, everything else will fall apart too. Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. I'll talk to him. Later that night, as the house grew quiet, Marcus found Elijah sitting in the corner of the boys' shared room, flipping through the pages of an old comic book. Sammy was fast asleep in the bed nearby, his breathing steady but shallow. Elijah, Marcus said gently, stepping inside. The boy looked up, his expression cautious. Yeah? Marcus sat down on the edge of Sammy's bed, keeping his voice low. I wanted to thank you for taking such good care of your brother today. Anna told me you've been reading to him. Elijah shrugged, his eyes flicking toward Sammy before returning to the comic book. He gets scared when he's sick. I just wanted to help. You did more than help, Marcus said, his tone earnest. You made him feel safe, and that's what big brothers do. But I also want you to know that you don't have to do it all by yourself anymore. You've got me and Anna now, okay? Elijah's fingers tightened around the edges of the comic book. But what if... He trailed off, his voice barely audible. What if you change your mind? The question hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Elijah, I know people have let you down before, and I know it's hard to believe that things can be different, but I'm not going anywhere. I promise you that. Elijah looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded, his voice quiet but steady. Okay. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The next morning, the house was filled with the smell of pancakes as Anna bustled around the kitchen, humming softly to herself. Sammy sat at the table, still a little pale but in better spirits, while Elijah helped set the table with a quiet efficiency that Marcus couldn't help but admire. You feeling better, kiddo? Marcus asked, ruffling Sammy's hair as he took his seat at the table. Sammy grinned, clutching his stuffed elephant. Yeah, Elijah says I just needed some superhero rest. Marcus chuckled, glancing at Elijah. Sounds like good advice. As the family settled in for breakfast, Marcus felt a rare sense of peace. For the first time in weeks, it felt like things were falling into place, slowly but surely. But the outside world wasn't so easily ignored. Later that day, as Marcus prepared to leave for the courthouse, he caught sight of the stack of letters sitting on the counter. The letters were a mix of support and criticism, sent by colleagues, strangers, and advocates alike, all weighing in on the ongoing custody drama. "You're going to be late," Anna said gently, coming up behind him. Marcus turned, his expression heavy. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing. For the boys, for us, for my career." Anna reached for his hand, her grip firm. "You're doing the right thing, Marcus. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." He nodded, pulling her into a brief hug before heading out the door. At the courthouse, the tension was palpable. Marcus could feel the weight of his colleagues' scrutiny as he took his seat at the bench. But as the day wore on, he found his mind drifting back to his family, to the sound of Sammy's laughter and the quiet determination in Elijah's eyes. By the time he returned home that evening, he felt more certain than ever that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, he had made the right choice. As the days turned into weeks, the Hensley household began to settle into a new routine. Elijah's reserved nature slowly began to soften, though his moments of vulnerability were fleeting and carefully guarded. Sammy, on the other hand, thrived under the warmth of Anna's care and Marcus's steady presence. His energy seemed to grow with each passing day, though his health remained a concern that weighed heavily on everyone. One Friday evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Marcus couldn't help but notice the way Elijah silently observed the scene unfolding around him. Sammy was chattering excitedly about a school project, while Anna encouraged him to try a bite of his vegetables. Elijah sat quietly, his fork moving the food around on his plate without much interest. "Elijah?" Marcus said gently, his tone encouraging rather than probing. "How's school going? Have you thought about joining any clubs or teams?" Elijah glanced up briefly before shrugging. "It's fine. I don't really do clubs." Sammy immediately jumped in, his voice brimming with enthusiasm. "Elijah's really good at drawing, though. You should see his sketchbook, Judge Marcus. He drew a dragon the other day that looked just like the one in my storybook." Marcus smiled, his interest piqued. "Is that true, Elijah? I'd love to see some of your drawings." Elijah shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact. "They're just doodles, nothing special." "Hey," Marcus said, leaning forward slightly. "If Sammy says they're great, I believe him. Maybe you can show me sometime. No pressure." Elijah hesitated, then nodded slightly, though he kept his gaze fixed on his plate. Anna reached over to gently squeeze his hand, offering him a warm smile. "Whenever you're ready, Elijah. No rush." Later that evening, after the boys had gone to bed, Marcus found himself sitting in the living room with Anna, reflecting on the subtle progress they had made. "He's still holding back," Marcus said, rubbing the back of his neck. "But I can tell he wants to trust us. It's just going to take time." Anna nodded, her expression thoughtful. "We're asking him to believe in something he's never had before. Stability. Love without conditions. That's a big leap for a kid who spent his whole life waiting for the rug to be pulled out from under him." Marcus sighed, leaning back against the couch. "I just hope he knows we're not going anywhere." Anna smiled softly, resting her head on his shoulder. "He'll know. We just have to keep showing him." The following week, an opportunity arose that tested that resolve. Marcus had been in court all day, navigating a particularly contentious custody case, when he received an urgent call from the boys' school. Sammy had experienced a mild asthma attack during gym class, and while he was now stable, the school nurse recommended that he be picked up early as a precaution. Marcus arrived at the school to find Sammy sitting in the nurse's office, his face pale but calm. Elijah was beside him, his arm protectively draped around his younger friend's shoulders. The sight stirred something deep in Marcus's chest, an overwhelming mix of pride and tenderness. "Sammy," Marcus said gently as he crouched down in front of the boys. "How are you feeling, buddy?" "I'm okay," Sammy replied, his voice soft but steady. Elijah stayed with me the whole time. Marcus glanced at Elijah, who met his gaze with a quiet intensity. Thank you, Marcus said sincerely. It means a lot to me that you were there for him. Elijah shrugged, but there was a flicker of something, maybe gratitude or relief in his expression. He's my brother, he said simply, as if that explained everything. Marcus placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder, his voice steady. And that's exactly why I'm so proud of you. Back at home, Anna fussed over Sammy, ensuring he was comfortable and had everything he needed to rest. Elijah lingered in the doorway, his posture tense as he watched Anna tuck a blanket around Sammy's small frame. You don't have to worry, Anna said softly, glancing over her shoulder at Elijah. He's going to be just fine. I know, Elijah replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. I don't like it when he gets sick. It scares him. Anna walked over and knelt in front of Elijah, her voice gentle but firm. You've done an incredible job taking care of Sammy, Elijah. But you're not alone anymore. Marcus and I are here now, and we'll do everything we can to keep him safe. You don't have to carry all of this by yourself. Elijah nodded, though his eyes remained downcast. Anna reached out to gently lift his chin, meeting his gaze. We're a team now, okay? You, me, Marcus, and Sammy, we've got each other. Okay, Elijah said quietly, though there was a hint of warmth in his voice that hadn't been there before. Later that night, after Sammy had fallen asleep, Marcus found Elijah sitting at the kitchen table, his sketchbook open in front of him. The boy didn't notice Marcus at first, too absorbed in the intricate lines he was drawing, a detailed depiction of a knight standing guard over a castle. That's incredible, Marcus said, startling Elijah slightly. You're really talented. Elijah closed the sketchbook quickly, his expression guarded. It's just something I do when I'm bored. Well, Marcus said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him, if this is what you do when you're bored, I can't wait to see what you create when you're inspired. Elijah looked at him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe the compliment. Finally, he opened the sketchbook again, turning it so Marcus could see more of his drawings. Marcus flipped through the pages slowly, marveling at the intricate detail and creativity in each sketch. These are amazing, Elijah, Marcus said sincerely. You have a real gift. Elijah shrugged, though there was a flicker of pride in his eyes. It's just something I like doing. Well, Marcus said, smiling, I hope you keep doing it. I think the world needs more artists like you. For the first time in a long while, Elijah smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. It was a moment Marcus would carry with him long after the house had gone quiet and the lights had been turned off. The room was filled with warmth as the echoes of their Happy New Year faded, leaving only the soft crackle of the fireplace and the occasional pop of fireworks outside. Elijah leaned his head against Marcus's side, his hand still clutching Sammy's. The moment felt surreal, like something out of the bedtime stories he used to make up for Sammy back at the orphanage. He glanced at the drawing still displayed on the mantelpiece, the one he and Sammy had created for their parents. It struck him how the simple act of being called family had shifted something deep within him. Anna pulled back slightly, brushing her hand through Sammy's hair. Did you boys make any resolutions this year? She asked, her voice soft but with a playful undertone that lightened the moment. Sammy perked up immediately. I already said mine. Soccer. He grinned, his face lighting up. I want to run super fast so nobody can catch me. Anna chuckled. Well, with all the work you've been putting in, I think you'll be the fastest kid on the team. She turned to Elijah, raising her eyebrows. What about you, Elijah? Any big plans for the new year? Elijah hesitated for a moment, his expression thoughtful. I guess. I just want to be a good big brother, and I want to stop worrying so much that everything will fall apart. I know you and Dad have told us we're staying forever, but... He trailed off, his voice faltering. Marcus leaned forward, resting a firm but gentle hand on Elijah's shoulder. Elijah, "Let me tell you something I've learned," he began, his voice calm but steady. "When you've spent a long time feeling like things aren't permanent, when people or places you love get taken away, it can be really hard to believe that something good will last. But this is real. It's permanent. And nothing you or Sammy could ever do would change that." Tears welled in Elijah's eyes, but this time they weren't from fear. He nodded slowly, letting Marcus's words sink in. "Thanks, Dad," he murmured. "Any time, son," Marcus replied, his own throat tightening as he pulled Elijah and Sammy closer. The fireworks outside gradually faded, replaced by the sound of snow falling gently against the windows. The boys eventually drifted off to sleep, curled up on the couch with their heads resting against their parents. Anna placed a soft blanket over them, her hand lingering on Elijah's shoulder for a moment, before stepping back to join Marcus by the fireplace. "They're finally starting to believe it," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "That we're not going anywhere." Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the sleeping boys. "It's been a long road," he said quietly, "but I think this year we can finally start building something lasting." The days that followed were filled with a mix of challenges and joy as the family settled further into their new life. Sammy's health continued to improve under Dr. Thompson's care, though he still needed frequent checkups. Elijah began to thrive at school, surprising both his parents and his teachers with his sharp mind and quick wit. One afternoon, Marcus arrived home earlier than expected, catching Elijah in the living room with his sketchbook open on the coffee table. The boy was so engrossed in his drawing that he didn't notice Marcus at first. "Working on something new?" Marcus asked, setting his briefcase down and walking over to join him. Elijah looked up, startled, then quickly tried to close the sketchbook. "It's nothing," he mumbled. Marcus stopped him with a gentle hand. "Hey, no need to hide it," he said with a small smile. "Can I see?" After a moment's hesitation, Elijah nodded and handed over the sketchbook. Marcus flipped through the pages, pausing on a drawing of a knight standing protectively in front of a smaller figure. Behind them was a castle with a warm glow emanating from its windows. "This is incredible," Marcus said, genuinely impressed. "What's the story behind it?" Elijah shrugged, but his cheeks flushed slightly. "It's just something I made up. The knight is protecting his little brother from all the bad guys. He doesn't let anything happen to him." Marcus's heart swelled as he realized how much of Elijah's art reflected his own life. "I think you'd make a great storyteller," he said, setting the sketchbook down. "Maybe one day you can turn these drawings into a comic book. I bet a lot of kids would love it." "You really think so?" Elijah asked, his voice tinged with both hope and disbelief. "I know so," Marcus replied. "And if you ever need help making it happen, you've got me and Mom in your corner." Elijah's smile was small but genuine, and for the first time, Marcus saw a spark of confidence in the boy's eyes that hadn't been there before. That evening, during dinner, Sammy excitedly recounted his latest visit to the doctor. "Doctor, Thompson said I can start running a little bit in the spring," he announced, his face glowing with pride. "That's amazing, sweetheart," Anna said, beaming at him. "Maybe Elijah can teach me how to play soccer," Sammy added, looking at his brother hopefully. "Sure," Elijah said with a shrug, though a small grin tugged at the corners of his mouth. "But only if you listen to me and practice every day." "I will," Sammy said eagerly, bouncing slightly in his seat. As Marcus watched the interaction between the boys, a sense of contentment washed over him. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would still be challenges and moments of doubt. But for now, they were together. And that was enough. That night, as Marcus and Anna tucked the boys into bed, Elijah looked up at Marcus with an expression that was both serious and vulnerable. "Dad?" he said quietly. "Yes, son?" Marcus replied, crouching down beside the bed. "I'm glad you didn't give up on us," Elijah said, his voice trembling slightly. "Even when things got hard." Marcus reached out, resting a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Giving up was never an option," he said firmly. You and Sammy are worth every challenge, every sleepless night, and I'm so proud to be your dad." Elijah's eyes filled with tears, but he smiled through them. "Thanks, Dad." "Anytime," Marcus said softly, ruffling Elijah's hair before standing to leave. As Marcus turned off the light and closed the door, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what he had fought for. This was the family he had always dreamed of, even if he hadn't known it at the time. Downstairs, Anna was waiting for him on the couch, a mug of tea in her hands. "Everything okay?" she asked as he sat down beside her. "Better than okay," Marcus replied, pulling her into his side. "We're finally home." The quiet hum of the house settled around them, filled with the promise of new beginnings and a love that would carry them through whatever came next. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows as the family gathered around the kitchen table for breakfast. Anna flipped pancakes on the griddle while Sammy tried to help by pouring syrup into a small dish. Elijah sat quietly, sketching something on a scrap piece of paper, his pencil moving quickly across the surface. "What are you working on, Elijah?" Anna asked, glancing over her shoulder as she plated the pancakes. "Nothing," Elijah said quickly, tilting the paper slightly to hide it. Marcus walked in at that moment, freshly showered and already dressed for court. He caught the exchange and smiled. "Still keeping secrets, huh?" he teased gently. "One of these days I'm going to convince you to share those drawings with us." Elijah smirked, but didn't respond, instead sliding the paper under his plate. Sammy, however, was much more forthcoming. "He's drawing us," Sammy announced, his voice filled with excitement. "I saw him working on a picture of the whole family last night." "Elijah," Anna said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to hide your talent. You're really good at what you do." Elijah shrugged, his face turning a faint shade of pink. "I just don't want anyone to make a big deal out of it." Marcus sat down at the table, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Fair enough," he said, "but when you're ready to share, we're all here to see it." Sammy, meanwhile, was too distracted by the pancakes to dwell on Elijah's hesitation. He happily dug into his breakfast, chattering about a class project he was excited to start. "We're supposed to make something about our family," he said between bites. "Miss Harris said we can draw pictures or write a story or even build something out of Legos." "That sounds like a fun project," Anna said, sitting down beside him. "What are you thinking about doing?" "I don't know yet," Sammy admitted, "but I think I want to make a picture of our new house with all of us standing in front of it." Elijah looked up from his plate, a flicker of interest crossing his face. "I can help you with that," he offered. "If you want." "Really?" Sammy beamed. "That would be awesome." Marcus watched the exchange with a quiet smile, his heart full. These small moments of connection between the boys were becoming more frequent, and each one felt like a step forward. They weren't just brothers in name anymore, they were becoming brothers in every way that mattered. Later that day, Marcus found himself back in his chambers at the courthouse, staring at a stack of case files that needed his attention. But his thoughts kept drifting back to his family. The image of Sammy's excited face and Elijah's shy offer to help with the project replayed in his mind, bringing a warmth that no amount of professional accomplishment could match. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Anna. "Sammy wants to show you something when you get home. Don't be late tonight." Marcus smiled, already looking forward to whatever surprise his youngest son had planned. By the time he walked through the door that evening, the house was buzzing with energy. Sammy ran up to him as soon as he entered, holding a large piece of poster board covered in colorful drawings. "Look what Elijah and I made," he said, his voice brimming with excitement. Marcus crouched down to take a closer look. The poster depicted a detailed scene of their home, complete with flowers in the garden, smoke curling from the chimney, and a family of stick figures standing in the yard. Each figure was labeled Mom, Dad, Elijah, and Sammy. "This is incredible," Marcus said, his voice full of genuine admiration. "You two did a fantastic job." "It was Elijah's idea to add the dog," Sammy said, pointing to a small figure in the corner of the yard. Marcus glanced at Elijah, who was standing a few steps back, watching the interaction with a faint smile. "A dog, huh?" Marcus said, raising an eyebrow. "Are you trying to tell me something?" Sammy giggled, while Elijah shrugged. "Maybe," Elijah said, his tone playful. Anna walked in then, carrying a tray of cookies fresh from the oven. "I see you've been roped into their plans," she said with a laugh, setting the tray on the table. "They've been talking about getting a dog all afternoon." "Well," Marcus said, standing up and ruffling Sammy's hair, "we'll have to think about it, but first let's get through dinner." That evening, as the family gathered around the table, the conversation turned to stories from Marcus and Anna's past. They shared tales of their early years together, of their awkward first date, and of the time Marcus had accidentally burned an entire batch of cookies trying to impress Anna. Sammy laughed so hard he nearly fell out of his chair. "You're a terrible baker, Dad," he declared. "I'll admit it," Marcus said with a grin. "But that's why I married your mom. She's the baking expert in this family." Elijah chuckled softly, his walls slowly but surely coming down with each shared laugh and story. After dinner, Marcus and Anna tucked the boys into bed, taking turns reading them a chapter from their favorite book. Sammy fell asleep quickly, his breathing soft, and even as Marcus gently brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. Elijah, however, stayed awake a little longer, his eyes wide and thoughtful as he stared up at the ceiling. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, sensing that something was on his mind. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked. Elijah hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. I was just thinking. I like it here. It feels safe." Marcus smiled, his heart swelling at the simple but powerful statement. "I'm glad to hear that, Elijah. This is your home now, and it always will be." Elijah turned his head to look at Marcus, his expression serious. "Even if I mess up, or if things get hard?" "Especially then," Marcus said firmly. "Families stick together no matter what." Elijah nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks, Dad." "Any time, son," Marcus replied, leaning down to give him a gentle pat on the shoulder. "Now get some rest. Big day tomorrow." As Marcus turned off the light and closed the door, he felt a deep sense of peace. The journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time it felt like they were truly becoming a family. The next day dawned bright and clear, with sunlight streaming through the windows as Sammy bounded down the stairs, his stuffed elephant clutched tightly in his hands. Elijah followed more slowly, his sketchbook tucked under one arm. Marcus and Anna were already in the kitchen, sipping coffee and going over their plans for the weekend. "Guess what?" Sammy announced as he hopped onto a chair at the kitchen table. "Today at school we're going to talk about heroes. Miss Harris said we could pick anyone we want to talk about. Superheroes, famous people, anyone." "That sounds like a fun assignment," Anna said, setting a plate of toast in front of him. "Do you know who you're going to pick?" Sammy nodded eagerly. "Yep, I'm going to talk about Elijah. He's my hero." Elijah, who had just sat down, froze mid-motion, his cheeks turning pink. "What? Why me?" "Because you're the bravest person I know," Sammy said matter-of-factly. "You always take care of me even when it's hard. Like that time you carried me all the way to the nurse's office when I couldn't breathe, or how you never let the big kids at the orphanage pick on me. You're way cooler than any superhero." Elijah looked down at his plate, his emotions too jumbled to put into words. Marcus reached over, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "Sounds like Sammy's got a pretty good reason to call you his hero," Marcus said. "And honestly, I agree with him." Elijah ducked his head, a small, shy smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks," he mumbled. By the time school rolled around, Sammy's excitement had reached its peak. He couldn't wait to stand in front of the class and tell everyone about his big brother. Elijah, however, spent most of the morning lost in thought. Sammy's words had struck a chord he hadn't expected, and for the first time, he began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he really was capable of being someone's hero. After school, as the boys climbed into the car, Marcus could see that Sammy was practically bursting with energy. "Guess what, Dad?" Sammy said as soon as Marcus closed the driver's door. "Miss Harris said my presentation was one of the best in the class." "That's great, Sammy," Marcus said, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. "What did everyone think about Elijah being your hero?" "They loved it," Sammy exclaimed. "A bunch of kids said they wished they had a big brother like him." Elijah, who was sitting quietly beside Sammy, glanced out the window, his face unreadable. But Marcus didn't miss the way Elijah's hand tightened slightly around the strap of his backpack, as if holding on to Sammy's words for strength. That evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Elijah surprised everyone by pulling out his sketchbook. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers fidgeting with the edges of the cover, before finally opening it and placing it on the coffee table. I drew something for Sammy's project," Elijah said quietly. Sammy's eyes lit up as he leaned forward to look. On the page was a detailed drawing of the two of them standing side by side, with Sammy holding his stuffed elephant and Elijah wearing a cape. Above them, in bold letters, were the words, "Brothers Forever." Anna let out a soft gasp, her eyes misting over. "Elijah, this is beautiful," she said, her voice filled with emotion. Sammy beamed, his excitement spilling over. "Can we put it on the fridge, please?" Elijah hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, sure." Marcus stood, carefully lifting the sketchbook and taking it to the kitchen. He grabbed a pair of magnets and placed the drawing front and center on the refrigerator, where everyone could see it. "Perfect," Marcus said, stepping back and admiring the artwork. "It's exactly where it belongs." For the first time that evening, Elijah's guarded expression softened into something resembling pride. The following weeks brought more moments like these, small but meaningful steps toward healing and trust. Sammy's health continued to improve, his energy returning bit by bit. He started attending soccer practice with Marcus on Saturdays, kicking the ball around the field with an enthusiasm that made Marcus's heart swell with pride. Elijah, meanwhile, began spending more time in the family room, sketching quietly while Marcus worked on case files at the dining table. The two didn't always talk, but the unspoken bond that grew between them during these moments was undeniable. One afternoon, as Marcus was flipping through a particularly dense legal document, he glanced over at Elijah, who was deep in concentration with his sketchbook. "What are you working on today?" Marcus asked casually, setting down his pen. Elijah hesitated, then turned the sketchbook around to show him. The drawing depicted a courtroom, with a figure sitting at a large wooden bench. It didn't take long for Marcus to realize that the figure was him. "This is amazing," Marcus said, his voice filled with admiration. "You got all the details right, even the gavel." Elijah shrugged, though his cheeks flushed with pride. "I thought it'd be cool to draw you doing your job. You're like a real-life hero, too." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "Thanks, Elijah," he said softly. "That means a lot." For the first time, Marcus saw a glimpse of the bond he'd been working so hard to build with Elijah. It wasn't always obvious, but it was there, growing stronger with each passing day. The warmth of spring began to settle over the Hensley household, bringing with it a sense of renewal and hope. Sammy's health was steadily improving under Dr. Thompson's care, and his excitement for soccer season had reached its peak. Elijah, though still reserved in his own way, had grown more comfortable in the rhythm of family life. He was no longer surprised by the soft knock on his door before bedtime, or the reassuring presence of Marcus and Anna during moments of uncertainty. One Saturday morning, the family decided to tackle a project together, planting a small garden in the backyard. Anna had suggested the idea weeks earlier, hoping it would be a fun and therapeutic activity for the boys. Marcus picked up the supplies, arriving home with bags of soil, gardening gloves, and a variety of flower and vegetable seeds. Sammy's face lit up when he saw the brightly colored packets. "Can we plant carrots?" he asked eagerly. "Of course," Anna replied, kneeling to show him how to hold the tiny seeds. "Carrots, tomatoes, and maybe some flowers, too." What do you think, Elijah? Elijah, who had been leaning against the porch railing, shrugged. I guess flowers would be nice. Marcus handed him a pair of gloves. Why don't you pick a spot for the flowers? You've got an eye for detail. I bet you'll make it look great. Elijah hesitated for a moment before taking the gloves and walking over to a patch of soil. He crouched down, inspecting the area with the same precision he brought to his drawings. Sammy, meanwhile, was already digging enthusiastically with a small trowel. This is going to be the best garden ever, he declared, dirt smudging his cheeks. Marcus chuckled, watching as Sammy's energy filled the backyard. He turned his attention to Elijah, who was carefully spacing out the flower seeds he'd chosen. You're doing a great job, Marcus said, crouching beside him. Thanks, Elijah replied, his voice quiet but steady. As the morning went on, the garden began to take shape. Sammy's laughter rang out as he attempted to water the plants, only to accidentally spray himself in the process. Elijah rolled his eyes but couldn't hide his smile as he helped his brother dry off with a towel. When they were finished, the family stood together, admiring their handiwork. The garden wasn't perfect. Some rows were crooked and a few patches of soil had been overwatered, but it was theirs. This is going to be amazing when everything starts to grow, Anna said, wiping her hands on her jeans. It already is, Marcus added, his gaze resting on the boys. You both did a great job. Sammy beamed, while Elijah ducked his head, a small smile playing on his lips. That evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Anna brought out a small photo album. I thought it might be fun to start a new tradition, she said, opening the album to the first blank page. A family scrapbook. Sammy's eyes widened with excitement. Can we put pictures of the garden in it? Absolutely, Anna replied. And anything else you want to remember? Birthdays, soccer games, holidays, all of it. Elijah hesitated, then spoke up. Can I draw something for it? Anna smiled warmly. I was hoping you'd say that. Your drawings would make it even more special. As the evening went on, the family worked together to fill the first few pages of the scrapbook. They pasted in photos of the boys playing in the backyard, added a few of Elijah's sketches, and wrote down memories from their first weeks together as a family. By the time they finished, Sammy was yawning, his head nodding sleepily against Marcus's shoulder. Elijah watched the scene quietly, his expression softening as he saw the care and love that surrounded them. You know, Marcus said as he gently lifted Sammy to carry him upstairs. This scrapbook is going to be pretty full by the end of the year. We've got a lot to look forward to. Elijah nodded, his gaze lingering on the pages they had just created. Yeah, he said softly. We do. The following weeks were filled with milestones, both big and small. Sammy scored his first goal at soccer practice, an accomplishment that left him grinning from ear to ear. Elijah began volunteering at an after-school program, helping younger kids with their art projects. One afternoon, Marcus stopped by the program to pick Elijah up early. As he walked into the classroom, he was struck by the sight of his son sitting at a small table, surrounded by children who were watching him sketch with rapt attention. And then you draw the wings like this, Elijah was saying, demonstrating how to create a butterfly. The kids leaned in closer, their faces lighting up as they followed his instructions. Looks like you've got a fan club, Marcus said with a smile, stepping into the room. Elijah looked up, his face turning pink. They just wanted to learn how to draw, he said modestly. Marcus crouched beside him, glancing at the butterfly sketch. You're a natural at this, Elijah. Maybe you should think about teaching art someday. Elijah shrugged, but there was a flicker of pride in his expression. Maybe, he said quietly. On the drive home, Marcus couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. Elijah was finding his place in the world, and seeing him thrive was more rewarding than Marcus could have ever imagined. When they arrived home, Anna was waiting on the porch with Sammy, who immediately ran to greet them. Guess what, Dad? Sammy said, practically bouncing with excitement. Elijah said he'd help me make a card for Miss Harris. She's my favorite teacher, and I want to give her something special. Marcus glanced at Elijah, who shrugged but couldn't hide his small smile. He asked for help, Elijah said simply. That's what big brothers are for, Marcus replied, ruffling Elijah's hair. The evening passed in a blur of creativity as the boys worked together on the card. Elijah sketched a detailed illustration of an apple tree, while Sammy carefully wrote a message in his neatest handwriting. Thank you for being the best teacher ever. When they were finished, Sammy held up the card proudly. Miss Harris is going to love this. I think she will, Anna said, pulling both boys into a hug. And I love seeing how well you two work together. Later that night, as Marcus and Anna sat together on the couch, reflecting on the day, Marcus said, You know, I didn't think I'd ever feel this way about fatherhood, but these boys, they've changed everything. Anna smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. They've changed us both, she said softly, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. As the house grew quiet and the boys drifted off to sleep, Marcus felt a sense of contentment settle over him. Their journey had been far from easy, but every step had brought them closer to the family they were meant to be. The next morning, the sound of birds chirping outside woke Marcus earlier than usual. He rolled out of bed and quietly made his way downstairs, careful not to disturb Anna or the boys. As he brewed his morning coffee, he glanced out the kitchen window and noticed Elijah sitting on the porch steps, sketchbook in hand. The boy's posture was relaxed, his pencil moving steadily as he worked on something. Curious, Marcus stepped outside, the cool morning air brushing against his face. Elijah didn't look up at first, too absorbed in his drawing. Marcus took a seat beside him, holding his coffee mug in one hand and watching silently for a moment. That's a nice spot you've picked, Marcus said finally, breaking the quiet. Elijah glanced up, startled but not annoyed. Yeah, he said softly, gesturing toward the backyard. The garden looks cool in the morning light. Marcus followed his gaze and smiled. The garden they had planted weeks earlier was beginning to show signs of life. Small green shoots poked through the soil, and the flowers Elijah had planted were just starting to bloom. You've got a good eye, Marcus said, nodding toward the sketchbook. Mind if I take a look? Elijah hesitated, then handed the sketchbook over. The page was filled with detailed sketches of the garden, each plant carefully rendered, with soft shading that brought the scene to life. This is incredible, Elijah, Marcus said, his admiration genuine. You've really captured the feeling of the place. Elijah shrugged, though his expression betrayed a flicker of pride. It's just something I do to relax. Well, whatever your reason, you've got a real talent, Marcus replied. He handed the sketchbook back and took a sip of his coffee, letting the quiet settle between them. You know, he added after a moment, when I was your age, I used to sit outside like this too. It was the only place I felt like I could really think. Elijah glanced at him, curious. What did you think about? Marcus smiled faintly, staring into the distance. All sorts of things, mostly about what I wanted to do with my life. Back then, I didn't have a lot of people I could talk to, so I spent a lot of time figuring things out on my own. Elijah was quiet for a moment, his pencil hovering over the page. Did you always know you wanted to be a judge? Not at first, Marcus admitted. I just knew I wanted to help people. It wasn't until I got older that I realized the courtroom was where I could do that. Elijah nodded thoughtfully, his pencil moving again as he added more detail to his drawing. I think I want to help people too, he said quietly. Maybe not like you do, but in my own way. Marcus felt a surge of pride. I think that's a great goal, Elijah, and I have no doubt you'll figure out the best way to do it. The sound of the back door opening interrupted their conversation, and Sammy appeared on the porch, still in his pajamas and rubbing his eyes. What are you guys doing? He asked sleepily. Just talking, Elijah said, closing his sketchbook. Come sit with us. Sammy plopped down beside them, leaning against Elijah's shoulder. The three of them sat there in companionable silence, watching as the morning light continued to stretch across the yard. As the day unfolded, the family decided to tackle another project together, organizing the attic. It was a task they'd been putting off since moving in, and Anna figured it would be a good way to spend the afternoon. "Who knows what treasures we'll find up there," she said cheerfully as they climbed the narrow staircase. "There might even be some old photos from when Marcus was your age." "Dad was a kid?" Sammy asked, his eyes wide with mock disbelief. "I thought he was always a grown-up." Marcus laughed. "Believe it or not, I was a kid once too. And if we find any embarrassing pictures, your mom will probably make sure you see them." The attic was dusty and cluttered, with boxes stacked haphazardly along the walls. Sammy immediately began exploring, peeking into boxes and pulling out random objects. Elijah took a more cautious approach, carefully opening a box labeled books and sifting through its contents. "Look at this," Elijah said, holding up an old hardcover book with a worn spine. "It's called The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn." "That's a classic," Marcus said, taking the book and flipping through its yellowed pages. "It was one of my favorites growing up." "Can I read it?" Elijah asked. "Of course," Marcus replied, handing the book back to him. "It's a great story. I think you'll like it." Sammy, meanwhile, had discovered an old photo album and was flipping through it excitedly. "Mom, Dad, look at this," he called, holding up a picture of a young Marcus wearing oversized glasses and a lopsided grin. Anna burst out laughing. "Oh, Marcus, you never told me you had braces." Marcus groaned, rubbing the back of his neck. "I was 13, okay? Let's just say it wasn't my most photogenic phase." Sammy giggled, clutching the photo like it was a prized possession. "Can we put this in the scrapbook?" Marcus sighed, but there was a smile tugging at his lips. "Sure, why not? If it makes you happy." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of laughter and discovery. They found old toys, faded letters, and even a box of Marcus's childhood art projects, most of which were met with playful teasing from the boys. By the time they finished, the attic was clean and organized, and the family had gained a new collection of memories to add to their growing scrapbook. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the family gathered in the backyard around a small fire pit Marcus had set up. They roasted marshmallows and told stories, their laughter echoing into the night. "Can we do this every weekend?" Sammy asked, his face sticky with melted marshmallow. "Maybe not every weekend," Anna said with a laugh. "But we can definitely make it a tradition." Elijah poked at the fire with a stick, his expression thoughtful. "I like it," he said softly. "It feels peaceful." Marcus glanced at him, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "That's what home is supposed to feel like," he said. "Peaceful, safe, and full of love." Elijah met his gaze, and for the first time, Marcus saw a look of pure trust in the boy's eyes. It was a moment he would carry with him forever, a reminder of how far they had come as a family. As the fire crackled and the stars began to appear overhead, Marcus wrapped an arm around Anna's shoulders, pulling her close. Sammy leaned against Elijah, his eyelids drooping as sleep began to take over. For the first time in a long time, everything felt exactly as it should. Summer arrived in full bloom, bringing longer days and a warmth that seemed to seep into every corner of the Hensley household. The once quiet house was now filled with laughter, small triumphs, and the sound of Elijah and Sammy creating new memories with their parents. One Saturday morning, the family gathered in the backyard to marvel at the garden they had planted together. The flowers Elijah had carefully tended were in full bloom, vibrant and alive, while the vegetables Sammy had been so eager to grow were finally ready to harvest. "Look at this one," Sammy exclaimed as he pulled a carrot from the soil, his small hands gripping it tightly. When it finally came loose, he stumbled backward, laughing as he held it up for everyone to see. "This has to be the biggest carrot in the whole world." "We might need to call the record books," Marcus teased, brushing dirt off the carrot before handing it back to Sammy. "Or maybe we'll just eat it for dinner," Anna added with a smile as she placed the carrot in a basket alongside the tomatoes and cucumbers they had already picked. Elijah stood off to the side, watching the scene unfold with a quiet smile. It amazed him how much things had changed since he and Sammy had come to live with Marcus and Anna. For so long, he had felt like a guest in his own life, waiting for the next disruption. But now, as he looked at his family working together in the garden they'd built with their own hands, a small voice inside him whispered a truth he was beginning to accept. This is home. Later that afternoon, Marcus called the boys into the living room, his face alight with excitement. "I've got a surprise for you two," he announced, holding up an envelope. Sammy's eyes widened as he bounded over to Marcus. "What is it?" Marcus handed the envelope to Elijah. "Why don't you open it and find out?" Elijah took the envelope hesitantly, sliding his finger under the flap and pulling out 2 tickets. His brow furrowed as he read the text printed on them. Red Hawks versus Thunderbolts, reserved seating. "Is this a baseball game?" Elijah asked, glancing up at Marcus in disbelief. Marcus grinned. "Not just any baseball game. You two have been invited as special guests. The Red Hawks wanted to honor your story. They were so inspired by your bond as brothers that they wanted to do something to celebrate you." Sammy let out an excited squeal, grabbing the tickets from Elijah to get a better look. "We're going to a baseball game. This is going to be the best day ever." Elijah, meanwhile, was more subdued, still processing the idea of being celebrated. "Why would they do that for us?" he asked quietly. Marcus knelt in front of him, his voice steady. "Because you and Sammy remind people what it means to stick together. Your bond is something special, Elijah, and the world needs more stories like yours." The day of the game arrived quickly, and the excitement in the air was palpable as the family made their way to the stadium. Sammy wore a brand new Red Hawks cap, while Elijah clutched a small notebook and pencil, saying he might sketch something if he got inspired. When they arrived, the boys were greeted with cheers and applause. An usher led them to their seats near the field, and Elijah's eyes widened as he took in the sheer size of the stadium. "Wow," Sammy whispered, gripping his brother's hand. "This place is huge." As the game began, the announcer took a moment to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we are honored to welcome 2 very special guests. Elijah and Sammy Hensley, your story of love and resilience has touched our hearts. Thank you for reminding us all of the power of family." The crowd erupted into applause and Sammy waved enthusiastically while Elijah sank into his seat, clearly embarrassed but unable to suppress a small smile. "You're famous," Sammy whispered, grinning from ear to ear. "Not really," Elijah muttered, but the warmth in his cheeks betrayed his modesty. The game itself was thrilling, with plenty of moments that had Sammy jumping out of his seat and cheering at the top of his lungs. Elijah even got caught up in the excitement, clapping and smiling as the Red Hawks scored a home run in the final inning. By the time the game ended, the boys were exhausted but glowing with happiness. As they left the stadium, Marcus noticed Elijah glancing back over his shoulder one last time, his expression thoughtful. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked as they walked to the car. Elijah nodded. "Yeah, it was a good day." That night, after Sammy had fallen asleep, Marcus and Elijah sat together in the living room. Elijah had his sketchbook open, working on a drawing of the stadium. "You know," Marcus said, watching him work, "you've come a long way, Elijah. I hope you're proud of yourself." Elijah paused, his pencil hovering over the page. "I think I'm starting to be," he admitted. Marcus smiled, resting a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You should be. You've got a big heart, and you're going to do amazing things." For the first time, Elijah didn't deflect the praise. He simply nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. As summer turned to fall, the Hensley family settled into a rhythm that felt natural and right. Sammy started his first soccer season, his determination and enthusiasm earning him the nickname Speedy from his teammates. Elijah continued volunteering at the after-school program, where the younger kids adored him and his talent for drawing. One crisp autumn afternoon, the family gathered in the backyard to rake leaves. Sammy, of course, couldn't resist jumping into the piles as soon as they were made, scattering leaves everywhere. "Sammy!" Elijah shouted, laughing as his brother launched himself into another pile. "You're making more work for us." "It's fun," Sammy replied, grinning mischievously. Marcus and Anna watched from the porch, their arms around each other as they soaked in the scene. "It feels like they've always been here," Anna said softly. Marcus nodded, his heart full. "It's hard to imagine life without them." That evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Sammy suddenly announced, "We should write a new story for our scrapbook." "What kind of story?" Anna asked. "A happy one," Sammy said, looking at Elijah. "About how we became a family." Elijah smiled, nodding in agreement. "Yeah, a story about how everything turned out okay." Marcus and Anna exchanged a glance, their eyes misty. "That sounds like the perfect story," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. And as the family worked together to write their story, one filled with love, resilience, and hope, they knew it was only the beginning of all the chapters they had yet to create.